In this lecture, I want to talk about this concept of independence and this related idea of the gambler's fallacy. And I think, honestly, this is one of the most important things we'll talk about in this class, because the gambler's fallacy is a fallacy. It's a wrong and misleading way of thinking. It's also one that it's really easy to fall into. We naturally commit this mistake, and it's really tenacious. I know that the gambler's fallacy is a mistake. I know it's a fallacy. I still find myself wanting to think this way, even knowing that this is wrong. So it's really tenacious. It's really hard not to do this. It's just a way that our mind seems to fall into thinking, but it's really misleading, so I think it's important to avoid. The other one of these, and we'll talk about this a little later, the other fallacy that I think is equally important and equally tenacious, we'll talk about the base rate fallacy in a few weeks. It's also one, it might be even more tenacious, even harder to get rid of, and it's also more important because it leads to some really bad thinking. So, honestly, if you guys get nothing else out of this course, if you can't remember anything else in 5 years, if you can remember the gambler's fallacy and the base rate fallacy, I will be happy. I think that will be something important, not just, as, hey, this is a fun fact, but also for your lives in general. This is important to know because it keeps you from making some really common but really bad mistakes. Okay, so let's get started. So two events are independent of each other when the outcome of one doesn't change the probability of the other. Okay, that's super abstract, right? Weisberg puts this in terms of A and B. He gives some examples. I think the best way to get your head around this is to think of more examples. So let's start with some events that aren't independent. So here's an example of a dependent event. Now suppose you were betting on whether someone would get a grade of B or better on her French final. I don't know why you would be betting on this, but if you were, just imagine you had to bet on it, right? And, I don't know, what your initial odds you'd want here are, whatever, what you think the chances of just a random person passing would be. Let's say you think, not just passing, but getting a B or better, let's say you think they're like 40%, right? Just random person, random French class, you think 40% chance of passing, right? You're going to bet, you're going to have odds with whoever you bet with, you're going to, choose an amount you bet, and the person asks you, it's like, well, okay, before you make a bet, do you want to know what she made on her midterm a month and a half ago? Before you decide what kind of odds you want, before you decide, how much you want to bet, would you want to know what this person made on her midterm? Would that be relevant for what kind of odds you would give her making a B or better on her final? Yes, of course, right? Look, if you knew she made an A on her midterm, you would up the chances she would make a B or better on her final by a lot, right? If you thought, first off, well, random person, I'll say 40%, you would up it to 50 or 60 or something, right? The amount doesn't matter. Different people would do up at different amounts. The point is, you find out she makes an A on her midterm, you are going to think it's more likely that she will do pretty well on her final, right? If you knew she made an F, you would lower the chances, right? You knew she made an A, you would bet more money, you would probably take worse odds. If you knew she made an F, you might not want to bet at all. If you did, you would bet less money and or you would want better odds, right? The point here is how you do on a midterm in a foreign language class tells us a lot about how you are likely to do on the final, right? Now look, there's no causation here. Sometimes one dependent event does cause another, but they don't have to be dependent, right? What we mean by dependent is when one event has happened, it tells us something about the odds of the other one. Look, somebody doesn't do well, foreign language, it's really cumulative. The stuff from early in the semester, you know, is important for later in the semester. So the very fact she does badly on the midterm would tell you, well, there's a lot of stuff she's missing. She's going to have to catch up. It's hard to do that. Reason to think she won't do as well in the final, right? If she gets an A, well, it's cumulative. She does know this stuff. Also, if she gets an A, it tells you, well, maybe she's good at French, right? I'll up the chances of that. She's probably a pretty hard worker. She probably studies. I'm going to up the chances that she'll do well in the final. No causation here, no direct causation, right? Doing badly on one test doesn't some way reach into the future and cause you to do badly on another one, but it does tell you a lot about the person and their ability in the class and their background. It tells you a lot of things that are relevant to how they will do on the next test. Look, there's no sure thing here, right? Maybe the person who gets an F will be like, damn it, I'm better than this. I'm going to work hard. I'm going to show them I'm going to get an A on this final. I'm going to try to salvage this class, right? That does happen. Maybe the person who gets an A will be like, man, this stuff's easy. I don't need to do any work, whatever, and we'll bomb the final, right? That happens. But the point is, what's likely, right? Person who makes an A on the midterm, much more likely to do well, even if it's not a sure thing, on the final. Someone who makes an F, much more likely to do badly on the final, even though that's not a sure thing, even though they can pull it out, right? Let me give you guys another example of a dependent event. Suppose you wanted to know the odds that someone will get the flu next year, right? I think of this a lot. My wife and I just had 2 babies. The flu is really, really kind of frightening for babies, right? It's pretty dangerous for really young infants. Babies can't get a shot. People we let around our babies, we do kind of want to know, okay, what's the odds this person's going to get the flu, right? Now, probably the biggest thing you can do to ask somebody if they get the flu is like, have you had a flu shot, right? But, another thing, might think is like, well, would you want to know the odds? Would you want to know if they've had the flu the last 3 or 4 years, right? Yeah, that would tell you something about how likely they are to get the flu. If somebody gets the flu every single year, it tells you, well, they are more likely than the average person to get it again this year, right? They are probably doing something, or there's something about them that makes them more likely to get the flu. Maybe they're just bad at washing their hands. I know, gross, some people are. My mom's a nurse. I'm pretty obsessive about this. I was even before COVID hit, right? Actually, washing your hands doesn't really do much to prevent the spread of COVID. It's all airborne, but wash your hands anyway. It stops the spread of a lot of other stuff, right? Flu being one of the things it stops the spread of, right? Maybe they just never get a flu shot and they get around a lot of people in enclosed spaces in the winter. Whatever, there's something going on, and well, this person is probably more likely than the average person to get the flu. The fact they get it, they've had it every year for the past 5 years, tells you something about how likely it is to happen this year. Now, it's probably not as informative as the French exam, right? There's a lot of linkage between how you do on the first exam in a foreign language class and how you do on the next one, just because the stuff is cumulative. But again, it tells you something that somebody keeps getting the flu every year, even if it doesn't tell you as much. Now let's change this up. Here's an example of an independent event. Suppose you're betting on a coin toss. Ordinary garden variety coin, you don't have any reason to think it's special or a trick, right? Just plain old quarter, Washington on one side, the eagle on the other. It's not even very old, right? Somebody has this coin and they say, all right, want to bet me some money that this lands heads. Maybe you do, maybe you don't. But look, if you did want to, or you were thinking if you wanted to take this bet, would you care about what the last coin flip 2 months ago was? Say this person told you, well, this has been in a cup on my desk for the last 2 months. You know, the last time I flipped it was 2 months ago. You know, would you want to know how it landed the last time I flipped it 2 months ago, right? I mean, maybe you would, I don't know, but like how it landed when it was flipped 2 months ago would tell you absolutely nothing about how it's going to land today, right? You know, how somebody did on their French midterm 2 months ago tells you a lot about how they're likely to do on their final 2 months later, maybe. You know, 6 weeks, 2 months, whatever, like some bit of time like that later, tells you a lot, right? How this coin landed 6 months ago or even 2 weeks ago doesn't tell you anything about how it's going to land today if we assume it's just an ordinary garden variety quarter, right? You wouldn't even care about the way it landed the last 3 times it was flipped, right? Why? Because they have no effect on how it's going to come down today. You certainly wouldn't care if somebody said, well, you know, would you want to know the last 10 flips of this coin over the past year? No, it's not relevant, right? If the person told you, well, the last time I was flipping this coin, the last 3 flips were heads. Never done that before, but I got this string of heads. Would you think, well, okay, well, suddenly, magically, because it landed heads 3 times in the past, it's due for a tails today, right? No, right? That's crazy. Whether somebody got the flu last year tells you something about whether they're likely to get the flu this year. Whether somebody got an A on their French exam or a lower grade, if they got an F, that tells you a lot about how they're likely to do on the next one. How the coin landed several weeks ago or a year ago tells you nothing about what the next flip is going to be. Or take some dice that you knew to be fair dice, right? Not trick dice, not loaded, whatever. Would knowing what the dice rolled the last time they were rolled a year ago tell you anything about how they're going to land today, right? Somebody said, well, they got snake eyes last time. Snake eyes, two ones. Really one of the less likely ways dice can land. Would you think, well, okay, well, it's even less likely they're going to land snake eyes, 2 ones today? No, again. This is what it means for events to be independent. The last roll, the last flip, tells you absolutely nothing about the probability of the next. That is all independence is. One way people put this, it's kind of metaphorical. People will say, well, these things don't have a memory. The coin doesn't remember how it was flipped, so it's not going to land a different way because it's landed one way in the past, right? The same with the dice. Contrast this again. The grade someone got on a French exam tells you a lot about how they're likely to do on the final. Whether you had the flu last 3 years tells you at least something about the odds of getting it next year. Not true with these independent events. So again, I think with these concepts, it's just helpful to go through lots and lots of examples. Some examples of independent events. How a fair roulette wheel rolls on each roll, right? If it lands on, red, this last roll doesn't make it any more likely to land on black the next. Each spin, right? How am I saying roll for a roulette wheel? Each spin is completely independent of the last. A fair slot machine, right? Each time you play the slot machine, you have exactly the same chances of winning. What happened on the last spin doesn't affect the next one. These things just have a random number generator, and if a certain number comes up, they give you money. If it doesn't, they don't. I think it's a series of numbers, and some give you a certain amount, but it's completely random. One spin doesn't affect the next. Another example of an independent event. Who wins the Berlin Mayor's race and the grade you get in this class? Right? There's no way, probably, right? Maybe if you were from Berlin or something and you were really unhappy about who won or really happy about who won. I don't know. But, there's no connection between the two, right? Who wins the Berlin Mayor's race doesn't affect you. There's also, none of the things that correlate to who wins the Berlin Mayor's race correlate to how well you do in the class. So who wins this Mayor's race tells me nothing about how you are likely to do in this class. Presumably, whether it's snowing on Mount Rogers being the tallest mountain in Virginia, it snows out there a lot, and whether you eat breakfast or not. No connection between these two. There's no way that whether it's snowing on Mount Rogers, affects you eating breakfast. None of the events that make it likely to snow or not likely to snow on Mount Rogers, like, the temperature in far southwest Virginia, none of those presumably have any effect, any correlation with what you choose to do for breakfast, right? Here's one that's very surprising. There's actually no, whether you will have identical twins, given that one of your parents is an identical twin, these are actually independent events. I'm really surprised by this, but there's really no genetic component to having identical twins. You might think that there is, right? You might think, well, if my dad's an identical twin and mine is, that tells us there's some factor in the family that makes identical twins more likely, some genetic thing, we don't know what it is, but it's there. We see this from dad being an identical twin, so it's more likely that I'll have identical twins because I might have gotten this gene, right? As far as scientists can tell, there actually is no genetic component to identical twins. Genetics plays no role at all as far as they can figure. Identical twins are no more or no less likely to have identical twins than are anybody else. The children of identical twins are no more or less likely to have twins than anybody else. The fact that my dad, as I think I've said, I have identical twins. My dad is an identical twin. Seems like really improbable. You might think, well, there, has to be a link here. There's not. It's just luck of the draw, right? So, final one, the gender of the next baby given the gender of the last baby, right? Usually speaking, right? You can imagine some really extraordinary events where, like if my wife and I, if we hadn't got the gender from the genetic testing for our babies, we knew they were identical twins. If one came out and he was a boy, we'd know there was a really good chance the next one was going to be a boy too, right? When he comes out in 4 minutes. But, normally the gender of the baby that you had in the past doesn't tell you anything about the next, right? There's no, as far as I can tell, there's not much of a genetic or other, component to the gender of your babies, right? You might think, well, people's environment, or maybe their genes, maybe the fact that somebody just had a girl tells us something because there's some environmental factor, or there's some genetic factor, or you eat a lot of oatmeal and that makes girls more likely. I don't know. You might think that there's something this tells us, and when it tells us this, it shows that the next child is more likely to be a girl. That's just not true. As far as we know, these are completely random. Unless, of course, you choose the gender of your children, which I think is at least scientifically possible, but it's pretty expensive, right? Alright, so hopefully you guys are getting a better idea of independent events. Sometimes events, or sorry, depend of independent events, right? One event tells you nothing about whether or what the probability of the next one happening is. So here's some example of dependent events. And you know, the truth is, dependent events are way easier to think of than independent ones. But let me just give you guys some random examples. These are like the first 5 that I kind of just thought of off the top of my head. So the first one, I don't know if you guys follow baseball. Hopefully you know enough about baseball to know what a ball and a strike is, right? Strike is when, the pitcher throws a ball and the pitcher either swings at it or it's in the strike zone, right? This is another one of those examples of the inclusive or. If it's outside the strike zone and he swings at it, he still gets a strike. Um, if it's inside and he swings at it, he gets a strike. If it's inside and he doesn't swing at it, he gets a strike, right? Anyway, good example of inclusive or if you follow baseball. But the thing is, if you follow baseball, you'll know that if the last pitch was a strike, it's more likely the next strike, the next pitch the pitcher throws will be a strike as well. Why? Well, a lot of baseball is mental. If a pitcher throws a strike, it helps him to settle down, it helps him to be confident, makes it easier for him to throw another, right? Also, when you get ahead in the strike count on baseball, gives you a lot more leeway what pitches you can throw. You can try to trick the batter, you can throw garbage, you can do whatever, you can try to make him swing at stuff he shouldn't. That makes it easier to get a strike. If the pitcher throws a ball, if the pitcher throws 4 balls, balls being balls that are way outside the strike zone that the pitcher doesn't swing at, if he throws 4 balls, the batter gets to walk, right? Well, if he's thrown 4 balls, the chances that the next pitch is going to be a strike go way down, right? Pitchers tend to get nervous, but also to not walk this person, they have to throw pitches that are generally way easier to hit, right? And it also becomes way harder to trick the batter. He's not going to swing at a pitch he shouldn't because he knows, well, I got 3 balls, I can take a strike, right? These are dependent events. Those of y'all who don't follow baseball are probably sitting there like, what in the world is he talking about, right? But, if you do, this hopefully makes sense. Even if you don't, I hope maybe it makes some sense. Another example of a dependent event, whether a presidential candidate is an incumbent and whether he wins. Political scientists say incumbent presidents tend to win. Doesn't always happen. You have Jimmy Carter, you have George H.W. Bush, you have Donald Trump, but usually the incumbent wins. Much more often than 50%. We can argue about what the reasons for that are, but if you look at the American history, incumbents tend to win. So, if you know that a presidential candidate is an incumbent, you are going to know that it's more likely that he's going to win. That tells you something about how this race is likely to turn out. A family history of fraternal twins actually tells you something about whether you will have fraternal twins. Fraternal twins being non-identical twins, right? Identical twins, it's when one fertilized embryo splits into 2. Fraternal twins are when there's 2 eggs and they're both fertilized, right? Now, it actually turns out that there's a pretty strong genetic component to fraternal twins. They're way more likely to happen in some groups than others. Some families, fraternal twins definitely do run in families. If you are a fraternal twin, or your dad or your mom is, your chances of having fraternal twins go up because there is a genetic component here. And if your mom, you can have fraternal twins without having the gene for it, but the gene makes it more likely. If your mom or dad was a fraternal twin, or if you were, tells you that it's more likely you have this gene, and if you have this gene, it's more likely your babies will be fraternal twins. So these are dependent events. Another dependent event, how long your grandmother lived and the odds you'll live past 80, right? You know, big genetic component in aging. If grandma died at 95, your odds of living pretty long go up. If grandma died at 60 of like some health problem, if she got hit by a train at 60, that probably doesn't tell us much about, what your health is going to be like. I don't know. Maybe there is some genetic or other environmental component for like walking in front of trains. I don't know. But probably it doesn't tell us much. But if she died from some disease fairly young, that tells us something that will lower the odds that somebody is going to live past 80, right? If we know that about their grandma. Whether your parents had high blood pressure, diabetes, and many other diseases, and whether you will, right? Your doctor will always take this long medical history because for a lot of diseases, there is a pretty strong genetic component. There's also an environmental component. You share environment with your parents. If there's something in the drinking water growing up that causes cancer, well, if your parents were drinking it, you were drinking it too, right? So knowing your parents' health or knowing even your siblings' health tells us a lot about what's likely or unlikely to happen to you. So let's talk about the gambler's fallacy. And, to call something a fallacy is not just to say it's a mistake about facts. It's a logical mistake. It's a mistaken way of thinking. And the gambler's fallacy is something different than just thinking that independent events are dependent. You might think, let's say with identical twins, you might think that whether your dad is an identical twin or whether you're an identical twin has an effect on the probability that you'll have identical twins yourself, right? You might mistakenly think that there is a genetic component to having identical twins. A lot of people do. I actually kind of thought this myself until we had identical twins, and I started doing some research on it. I'm like, oh, okay, well, there's not, right? This is no more or no less likely to happen to you if you have identical twin, or sorry, if you are a twin, or if your dad or your mom is a twin, than otherwise, right? That's just a mistake about facts. That's not a fallacy. The gambler's fallacy, in a very deep way, involves thinking, almost believing in a contradiction. So let me give you guys an example of the gambler's fallacy. And this is one that I keep falling prey to myself. So I keep thinking, well, it's really remarkable. Just utterly remarkable that I had identical twins when my dad is an identical twin. I catch myself thinking, well, man, what are the chances that these two unlikely things would happen? Here's where the mistake is, though, right? Look. I seem to be thinking that there's some connection between my dad being an identical twin and my own children being an identical twin. But that would make it a dependent event when I know it's not. But if it were a dependent event, it wouldn't be that remarkable, right? The fact my dad is a twin would make it much more likely I would have twins, right? So when I think that there's some sort of link between the two, I'm thinking of, well, they're dependent events, right? But when I think it's unlikely, I'm acting like they're independent events, right? What seems remarkable here is, I believe, two contradictory things. Independent, so unlikely, but also dependent, so the fact my dad is a twin makes it even more unlikely that I'd have twins, right? If they're dependent, they're not that unlikely. If they're independent, the fact my dad is a twin has absolutely no bearing on whether I have twins or not. It's a weird sort of mental two-step, and we do believe two contradictory things at once. That seems to be at the root of the gambler's fallacy. That's why we call it a fallacy and not just a plain old garden variety mistake. Here's another way to look at it. If you picked out a random grandfather and a random pregnancy, what are the chances that the granddad would be an identical twin and the babies would be identical twins? About 1 in 62,500, right? We'll talk about why this is in a minute. We talk about multiplying probabilities. But unless I've just completely messed up my math and I'm not that bad at math, these are the odds, right? What would be the odds of 3 generations of identical twins? 1 in 15,625,000. But given the odds that you are an identical twin or your dad is, what are the odds that the next baby will be? 1 in 250. These are the general odds. They don't change. And the reason is here, an unlikely thing has happened, but we've already said these events are independent. The fact that this really unlikely thing has happened doesn't tell us anything about how likely a similar unlikely event is to occur in the future. Doesn't at all. What are the odds that the next baby will be an identical twin given that dad and granddad are? Again, 1 in 250. Again, and a really unlikely thing has happened, or actually 2 unlikely things, but they're independent, so that doesn't tell us anything about whether it's more or less likely to happen in the future. The odds are still the same. Before you flip a fair coin 10 times, it's really unlikely that you will have 10 heads in a row. But past events don't have any bearing on the next flip. If you have 9 heads, if you flipped it and you've got 9 heads, the odds of the next one being heads are still 1/2. And because the odds are 1/2, the odds that you'll get 9 heads in a row, or sorry, 10 heads in a row, given that you flip 9 heads in a row, aren't 1 in 1,024, they're 1/2, given that you now have this string of 9 heads, right? The gambler's fallacy is incredibly hard to escape. Like I said, I teach this stuff, and I have to watch myself not to fall into the gambler's fallacy. Now, one thing, just the main thing in this class is be able to spot the gambler's fallacy and don't make it, right? Call it the gambler's fallacy for a reason. Gamblers are very prone to this. It's one of the reasons they gamble in the ways they do. It costs people money, right? You will make bad decisions if you fall prey to the gambler's fallacy. You will lose money or otherwise do dumb stuff. I do think it's worth saying a little bit about why the gambler's fallacy is so hard to escape. I think part of this is we take the wrong view of a series of events. We wrongly act as though we're viewing the series from the beginning when we know nothing about it, rather than viewing it from where we are when if you say, if there's 10, I'm going to flip a coin 10 times, what are the odds I won't get a single heads or I won't get a single tails, that they'll all come up the same way? 1 in 1,024, right? But if you're 9 flips in and you have 9 heads or 9 tails, you don't act as though you're viewing it from the beginning, because that's not where you are. You view it from where you are, and from where you are, those past 9 flips aren't relevant, only the next one is, right? Same with the twins. Another is, when something unlikely happens, we rightly tend to revise our views about whether events really are independent. If a roulette wheel stops on black 10 times in a row, you're probably going to rightly think that the casino is cheating, right? There's ways to do this, like I think the biggest one is just a magnet under the wheel will stop it at a certain point. But the thing to do there isn't to think, well, just because black has come up all these times, red is more likely to come up now. If you think they're really dependent, then you got to ask, well, the house is cheating, how are they likely to cheat, right? Who knows, right? That's a hard guessing game to play. If a family had 5 generations of identical twins, we'd probably start to think there is a genetic component here. But then again, we don't revise it to think, well, it's less likely at each generation. That's the stupid part. The smart part would be to revise it to think, well, okay, if there's a genetic component, it becomes much more likely, right? We revise whether we think they're independent, but we tend to revise the probability in the wrong way. Hope that makes sense. It's complicated, but we rightly revise, but we do it in not a way that's not really the smartest. I think a final reason we're so prone to the gambler's fallacy, Weisberg doesn't talk about this, but I think it's true, is that we want life to be fair. We want there to be some kind of moral order to how things happen. If I were betting and I kept betting on heads and losing every single time, if we were betting money on coin flips and I kept betting heads and you got 5 straight tails, that's not fair, right? That's some bad luck on my part that's just not fair. And part of the reason I want to say, well, I'm due for a heads is we want things to be fair. We want the world to be fair, right? When someone's had a string of bad luck, that person, and maybe even us, think, well, he's due for some good luck because this bad luck isn't fair. Or when some horrible jerk has had some long string of good luck, we want that jerk to have some bad luck because not only does he not deserve this good luck, we probably think he deserves some bad luck, right? But, it's not the way things are. You don't, as far as I can tell in life, you don't get punished just because you're a jerk. You might get punished because being a jerk, you make enemies and they will settle things up with you. But just the mere fact of your jerkiness does not seem, at least in this life, to get you punished, right? And at least, the fact you've had undeserved bad luck in the past, again, the ledger doesn't seem to get, evened up, at least in this life, right? Maybe there's another life where things do even out. I hope there is. But, in this one, the rain falls on the just and unjust alike, right? And I do think we're really prone to the gambler's fallacy because we don't want to admit that. When we've had bad luck, we think we're due for some good luck to settle the ledger. When we see some horrible jerk who's had a string of good luck, we think he's due some bad luck, even more to settle things up. As far as I can tell, things just don't work that way, right? It's a very, very, very deep human instinct to want this. I think it's part of what sets us up for the gambler's fallacy. And my guess is, I'm not a psychologist, I don't know, I haven't done a lot of research, but my guess is this is a lot of why we're so prone to it. At any rate, at the end of the day, it maybe doesn't matter why we're so prone to the gambler's fallacy. That's psychology, this is a philosophy class. Maybe knowing why we're prone to it will help us avoid it, but the important thing at the end of the day is recognize it, avoid it.